Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and I want to welcome you to day 178 of Humanity Rising. Humanity Rising is an initiative of Ubiquity University and over 300 partnering organizations from all over the world that arose last spring as we were entering into the depths of the pandemic as an offering to allow people on a daily basis to come together globally to share their experiences of what it's like navigating through this unprecedented collective experience, and to confer with one another as to how we can share solutions and strategies to ensure that the world beyond the pandemic is more resilient and regenerative, healthy, and in alignment with natural systems. It's been an amazing journey. Day by day, week by week, month by month, well over 800 speakers and people joining in from over 130 countries all over the world to come together in the spirit of community, in the spirit of radical collaboration, to work together to ensure that out of this crisis, humanity can rise in a more abundant way. One of the main thematics of our time together each day is how we attain heart coherence. So we like to start every day with just pausing for just a minute or two. Take a few deep breaths. Close your eyes. And place your attention on your heart. See if for just a minute or two you can listen to your heartbeat in a spirit of gratitude and thanksgiving that you're alive with people worldwide beating together with one heart. Thank you, everyone. And now, with an open heart and a heart full of gratitude for each and every one of you who have joined us today, I want to begin our session by saying that one of the most powerful tools in our world today are the movies, are the documentaries that display, either through prose or poetry, fiction or nonfiction, images that capture us, knowing that a single picture is worth 1,000 words. All through history, it's been the power of story. It's been the power of song. And more recently, it's been the power of Hollywood in shaping world culture that has had an indelible influence on how we think, how we learn, and how we transform. And today, we want to focus on a movie now in its second iteration, a movie called Thrive that initially came out a number of years ago and had an impact on the social movement working for a better world. We're delighted today to have with us someone who's been on Humanity Rising before, and again with Peter Merry, who drops in occasionally to have one of his splendid dialogues with an individual of note and with a seminal message for us all. So Peter, I want to welcome you to Humanity Rising and turn the program over to you.
Great. Thank you, Jim. And good to be back. Yes. Today, great to have Marshall Lefferts with us. Marshall, you can turn your video and things
great.
on now.
I'm here.
There you are. Great. Yeah. So I'm very excited about today's session, mainly because the Thrive movie and related movement and all the things around it have challenged me personally deeply on my assumptions about a number of different things. But, you know, sometimes you get these challenges and you kind of dismiss them because they come from people you kind of get a sense of, yeah, well, it's just a loony or something. But there's quite a few people I deeply respect who are, you know, engaged in this movement and hold perspectives that challenge a number of my perspectives. And so I've been grappling with that over the last few months to try to see, okay, what is my position now? What is my belief in all of this? And the Thrive movies and the kind of discussions that have developed around them have really got me asking some very fundamental questions. And when I thought about who could I actually talk to about this, I immediately thought of Marshall, because I know him from his wonderful work in cosmometry on the sacred geometry that very much inspired my evolution thesis that I did for my PhD at Wisdom. And as an individual who I know is very open-minded, grounded, got a great heart, and deeply connected to the cosmos. And has been very involved in the whole Thrive movie scene and movement around it. So we had a couple of chats before, and then I thought, you know, how selfish just to keep these to ourselves. Let's have this conversation publicly, because there's so many topics that are of relevance today around the state of the world, around the technologies we need, around why these technologies aren't coming to light, around the role of government and the state compared to a more libertarian approach, which releases more the individual's power in the context, around conspiracy theories, you know, that have often been thrown and banded around the whole Thrive movement. So what is actually going on? What can we discern here that seems to resonate with us? And how do we navigate our way through this world of news story, of challenges to our ways of seeing the world, and to all this kind of confusion around conspiracy, or what has been called recently conspiratoriality, the ability to be able to discern between what seems to be of truth in some way in this and what is kind of fabrication, and how do we find our way through that thicket. So I can think of nobody better than Marshall to be diving into this conversation with. And maybe Marshall, just, you know, a little introduction would be great to start with to yourself and your relationship to Thrive. And then I'd love you just to tell us a little bit of the story of thrive and the impulse behind it, and bring us up to date on where it came from and where we're at now.
All right, thanks, Peter. Thanks, Peter and Jim and everybody at Ubiquity University Humanity Rising for inviting me to be here today, and Peter for instigating this conversation. It is certainly a timely one to have in our world. And I would say there are probably two better people you could talk with, which are Foster and Kimberly Gamble, the filmmakers. So in terms of who you get here today, I'm certainly very close with Foster and Kimberly. There's two of my dearest friends and colleagues and allies. And I have the privilege and honor and joy of having been associate producer of both Thrive 1 and Thrive 2. And then for Thrive 2, Foster is a longtime colleague of myself and Nassim Haramein, and a deep researcher into the cosmic geometry, the nature of the field. And in Thrive 2, we worked together co-directing the visual effects that are throughout the film that depict the geometry and the dynamics of the field. And we'll talk a bit more about that aspect of it, because it's really a very important aspect of what is being presented. And yeah, so I have been very close in the conversation with Foster and Kimberly and others, and certainly in the production of the films and the intent and purpose of them. I will say that I'm here really representing myself. I'm not speaking for Foster and Kimberly, and I'm really happy, Peter, to have a conversation where we as individuals can reflect on these questions. I have similar questions, not that I have disagreements with what's presented. It's that what is presented evokes exactly these kinds of questions, and really that's part of the purpose, is to evoke a conversation, to ask questions, to really look at some fundamental aspects of what is the nature of our world, what is the nature of our human experience, what is the nature of the cosmos, and how can we engage in an inquiry that looks at the whole of it, and also looks at the relationship of our current state of the world to what we understand by looking at the whole of it. And so I know for Foster and Kimberly, the intention is to share an understanding of the greater nature of things as a context for asking questions about, well, what is really preventing us or inhibiting us from creating a thriving, sustainable world? That since we understand very deeply now the scientific nature of a unified field, and of how we can interact with that field in many ways, which we can explore, as I said, a little bit more. And what comes out of that understanding is an ability to make a very radical shift from a world and an experience of our life that has generally been based on a feeling of scarcity and conflict, and the dynamics that are very much at play in our world at this time, and into a world that is actually founded on the alignment with that underlying field, the field that's present at all times, that is actually vastly abundant, and the progression into creating technologies that are using are resonant with that alignment with the field. We were talking a little bit about some of that before coming on here today, and some of these more resonance and energy-based technologies that are simpler than so much of what we have right now in our world, that can make such a big shift. And then also our internal alignment with it, which then informs the more societal aspect, shall we say, or the social, cultural aspects of what it would mean to have a thriving world. So
I mean,
that's a picture of the intention of it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, if I kind of feels like there's three elements to the movies as I kind of experience them. One is, and this is the kind of really, well, there's two bits which I find really inspiring and are completely alignment with, and there's a third bit that I find challenging. And they describe beautifully in a way the new science and new consciousness with the geometry and the sacred field and unified field and how all of that works, which fits completely with what everything I discovered in my 7 years of PhD research into evolution and things. So and they're beautifully presented with great graphics and everything else. And then they go into looking at the technologies that, in a way, like you say, are resonant with that perspective, which means, for example, technologies that can generate energy in a much more efficient way than we currently generate energy. And kind of related things that could really solve, and health solutions, for example, health technologies that can really solve a lot of the challenges that we're grappling with. Really, really inspiring, and the amount of effort they've put into actually finding these technologies and then doing the due diligence around them and really checking, are they real and do they work? Because there's obviously a bunch of wackos out there who claim to have all sorts of free energy devices and things, and then they don't actually work. So that's really inspiring. And then the power of the question afterwards is, so if all of these technologies exist, why aren't they getting into the world right now? Right. And so up to that point, I'm kind of yes. And then they get into their story around why, their theory, as it were, on why those technologies are not getting into the world. And essentially, and maybe you can clarify it a bit more, but essentially that there is a group of very powerful and wealthy people who see the emergence of these technologies and this perspective as a threat to their position and power, and who are therefore organizing to ensure that those things don't come into the world. And then as part of that story, I hear them kind of criticizing the United Nations and the sustainability agenda or climate change, and questioning things around COVID. And that's when that's the bit that I trying to allow myself not to get kind of completely dismiss it, but to sit with it and say, could this be true? Right. And what is it that they're actually saying here? And because a part of me is going, well, am I just being naive? Right, thinking, oh, there isn't some great big, group of rich, wealthy people, etc., who are trying to control things. It's just people creating a story, as it were, that somehow feeds their needs. So is that true? I can't really tell whether it's true myself, obviously, because I haven't done the research myself. So you either choose to believe somebody or not. And that's those three pieces, really: the picture of the cosmos and their understanding of the new science, the work they're doing with Nassim Haramein and all of that, and then the technologies, the exposure of these technologies that could really accelerate our evolution in a way that's very people and planet friendly and really takes a holistic approach. And then the kind of source of the problem and the solution side, which they go into more being about a reduction of the state, much more of a libertarian perspective, let's say, on things. And the current theme, like on the Thrive channel, is around a state-free world, and I've got a few thoughts on that. But have I described well the different elements of it in that sense? Would you add anything to that picture or correct any perspective?
I think you did a great job, Peter. I appreciate that. I was curious to hear how you would represent it, and you did that, and I appreciate that. So I think that's overall very accurate general description, especially both of Thrive 1 and Thrive 2, but more so in Thrive 2, because it really showcases more of the nature of the field, the patterns, and the technologies that are based upon resonance with that field. And then the very questions you raised about, well, if that's the case, how come we are not able to readily have some of these technologies in the world? What is the reason behind the challenge of that? And then the in a way kind of eternal quest for freedom, and what does freedom mean, is really the primary theme, based upon the principle of non-aggression as really a foundational principle to really for the context of this very inquiry. You know, that is the principle upon which to engage in the questions that are being explored here.
Can you share with people a bit more about exactly what that is, the non-aggression principle, and where it comes from?
Yes, well, I don't know if I know where it comes from. I know it really is foundational to both Gandhi and Martin Luther King and the revolutions of thought and societal change that they pursued. And it is defined in the film as that no one can initiate force against anyone else against their will, except in true self-defense. And so it's a principle of really kind of putting in check the idea that through force, one person can have authority and control over others that is against the will of the ones who are being controlled. And so it's a real fundamental, raises a fundamental question about the nature of authority and the nature of power and force and control, and how we have created that in our world, in our systems and structures that we very much take for granted, actually, as just being so. You know, that's just the nature of reality, when in fact it's actually, as is the case, I would say, with pretty much all of human societal systems and structures, they're contrived. We have invented them. We have made them up. We tell ourselves a story, actually, that this is so, this is what's true, this is the way it works. And we might even say that the story is really the foundation of this whole inquiry here. What story are we telling ourselves, and why? And why are we believing that story? And so, you know, some of what you've raised as questions are aspects that in the film that certainly are raising the same questions among many people. I will say, just to be clear on behalf of Foster and Kimberly, that they're often portrayed as presenting a libertarian political viewpoint. And I know from their perspective, what they are presenting is a transpolitical perspective, one that is not based in a political framework. Obviously, it has to be filtered in through that framework to have some relationship to what this inquiry is all about. Yet the overarching perspective is a transpolitical one that is not based upon political dynamics, but is really based upon principles. Mm-hmm. And you know, with the non-aggression principle and the principle of integrity and wholeness and unity, which is the nature of the field, as guiding principles for this inquiry.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's, I think, one of the reasons it's so hard to place for people, because it doesn't fit in just one box on the political spectrum. Although, as you say, some people might point to a kind of more right-wing libertarian perspective. At the same time, you know, all the stuff they're talking about, you know, the ecological needs, even though I don't think they necessarily question the fact that climate change is happening, but they question how it may be used to centralize power to control others, right? Have I understood that correctly?
That's correct. Yes.
And so So one of the, on that whole, the non-aggression principle, part of what I've understood about it is that, that definition of not forcing somebody to do something against their will, is included or includes in that laws. So not being able to create laws that would stop somebody from doing something against their will, and therefore also have police, let's say, to enforce those laws. Because if somebody wanted to do something against their will, as long as it didn't, and this is the kind of dynamics of it, as long as it didn't harm anybody else. That's the principle, right? You can do anything. You should be free to do anything as long as it doesn't harm anybody else. That's correct, I think.
I would say in essence, that would be correct. There's one aspect of what you just said that is not what is being presented in the film. You use the word laws in the film. The word rules is being used.
Yeah,
and rules are like rules of a game. Here's how we're playing together. These are the rules that we are, in order to have a dynamic, interactive relationship, which is what the world is, and our lives are made of. There need to be rules and guidelines that allow us. We come to a stoplight, it's red, you stop. That's what you might call a rule, right? That we all agree to.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't, you could have an accident, or those who are serving to enforce the rules can do their job. Mm-hmm. And that is still consistent in the message that's being portrayed. What is being questioned is the role of rulers, those who are ruling over others with a kind of an authority that in our current world includes the aggressive aspects of what authority can mean in ways that are being questioned, basically. Like, why are we abdicating ourselves to this kind of an authority, especially, I would say, in a system that has just rampant with corruption on many levels, which is another aspect of what needs to be ultimately questioned and addressed. So, but to your point, it's not like, okay, it's a free-for-all, everybody, no more rules, no more laws, do whatever you want as long as you don't harm anybody. Good luck with that. That's really probably not going to work. Mm-hmm. What is being proposed is that, again, it's about having clear rules, clear agreements, what engagement in society and interacting with, beyond ourselves and our families and those agreements we have, does require having rules that we understand, that we agree to, and that we engage with, without, and then it can have levels of enforcement of those rules that are, police that may not be government service forces. They could be more localized and more kind of private to a certain region or community, for example. And that the main question is one around having rulers the way that we experience it in our world at this time. Mm. So I would say that's the main distinction from what you said.
Okay, that's useful. And the people are saying the laws distinction is useful, but it still comes back to the question, doesn't it, of like, who makes the laws and who enforces them and who controls the enforcers of the laws, right? And that, so how can that, because they're, so how can that coexist with the idea of a state-free society? I mean, are you going to have someone's got to make the laws and somebody's got to enforce them, right? So that people aren't allowed to go through the red traffic light, as it were, and they get punished in some way if they do. So how do you know how they kind of, what the alternative is to a state, or how that decision making would work and how things get enforced?
I am certainly not an expert in this aspect of the conversation. It's very deep. It's really kind of gets to the heart of the inquiry that we're having, and that is being engaged by Foster and Kimberly through the films, by others who have been in the film, who are representing their understanding. Mary Ruard and Larkin Rose and Stefan Molyneux, are all people who have been deeply investigating this very question. And so I'm happy to engage in an inquiry with you, Peter, about it, in some ways as much asking the same questions and exploring the possibilities. My sense of it and a bit of understanding of that is that the context of the inquiry, that as it's being put forth, is in a world that is stateless, and that's an ideal, let's say, an idea that getting from here to there is very that's a very big question. How does that even happen? And then what would that look like? So obviously, in order for that to be, and let's just say we're assuming there's a valid desirability of achieving that kind of in the world, which is what's being put forth in the films. And getting from where we are to that kind of a state, or let's say a stateless state, is a process that requires a transitional strategy. And so my understanding is that the empowerment to make rules and to enforce them shifts from a large structure, governments, and where it seems to be heading right now, more of a globalized governing system, which we can talk about what that implications of that are in the current state, to regional and localized and community-based decentralization of the authority to create rules and to enforce those rules. Becomes more and more about empowering the smaller scales to be the ones that are guiding, because actually culturally, regionally, in terms of ecosystems, climates, cultures, like I said, cultures already, there's so many dynamics that will inform how a group, a community, will want to interact and need to interact, that may be different from what's being imposed from another source. And sometimes the imposition from another source overrides the ability for that community to actually do what's better for them. Mm-hmm. And so the idea is ultimately to empower the ability to do what's best for, best for myself as an individual, from the standpoint of the non-aggression principle, where I can, do what's really going to be best for me without causing harm or disruption involuntary for other people. And then up and out from there into our families and our small towns and communities, and then regionally. And then, when it gets to the question of the global aspect of the kinds of rules that will guide the large scale interactions, which of course are rapidly advancing at this time. Who that is and how that works, I can't say I have an answer to that at this time. I do feel that the current direction towards centralization and consolidation of power and control is concerning, very concerning at this time. And especially because, technologically speaking, it can rapidly come into a very, very dominating control system with pervasive surveillance, which is rapidly increasing at this time as well, which when it's in the context of a dominating control system, can become a very dangerous thing in my mind, and not necessarily a desirable direction we want to go as a global community. And so it's very much a question to ask right now in relationship to then how can we achieve that kind of a goal at that level, as you were asking about.
Yeah, it reminds me of the whole concept of subsidiarity, which is what the EU, European Union initially tried to work with and hasn't been that successful in. But the idea of subsidiarity is that you have decision making at the lowest appropriate level, and there are certain topics that need to be dealt with at the local level, but then there are others that spill over to the regional, say to the national, and indeed now with our global ecological commons to the global. And so the question then becomes, okay, given that there are global issues that actually need some kind of global governance at some level of agreements globally, because the air and the water, all of these things aren't limited to any of our boundaries, is something that that one country might do could have a big effect on another country somewhere else, like we saw with the outbreak of SARS, for example. But how do you at the global level, or even at the national levels, how do you put in place the processes of governance there that that deal with the issues in a way that aren't, let's say, that are still connected to the context, as it were, that aren't, like you say, a kind of controlling power that just seems to exist independent of the context in its own kind of bubble. That seems to be an unresolved challenge and a potential risk of pushing for the, let's say, reduction of the state at this time, could lead to us actually getting less done. I mean, let's just take, just take the example of Trump, for example, and the kind of policies that he was implementing, focused more on, let's say, wanting to allow the drilling to go ahead in Alaska or whatever, or the pipelines, or pulling out of kind of the Paris Agreement and those kind of things. Whereas at the moment, we're needing collectively to try to work out how do we collaborate, right, to solve some of these issues. And although a United Nations or a European Union is far from an ideal governance body, in a way, it's the best we've got at the moment as humanity, as we try to work out how do we, with all our diversity and our different interests and everything, how do we learn to work together cross boundaries to be able to solve the problems that are of relevance, let's say, at that level. And that, I feel, somehow, as you say, it's not result. There's no kind of answer to it yet, but feels like one of the key tensions.
Mm-hmm. It's so heart and soul to this conversation, right there, because it informs everything. What's coming to my mind is, first of all, yes, we are obviously going to need to have a global governance process. And I think there's a distinction between a governance process and governmental structures that is an important one to bring into it. And so with an emphasis on the governance process, with the non-aggression principle and other principles as the foundational guiding ideals here, then we can at least envision a process that can be in support of addressing these kinds of issues that you raised. Obviously, the way the process goes right now is so polarized and conflicted in politics. So you bring up Trump and these things that are, from our perspective, egregious to nature and to the advancement of a outdated, outmoded, polluting technology for the sake of business interests is not, in my mind, how we want to go. And I'm sure that's the case with so many people. And in other people's minds, yes, it's exactly how we want to go, because their business interests are completely aligned to that. And so we have this conflicted, polarized, ongoing conversation, which is just massively put in our faces by the media every day, that again, how that structure may come into place and how that governing process may work is yet to be fully understood. And it needs to be questioned and envisioned and ultimately designed. Now, I just want to just put that in a bigger context, which is the context of, which is represented in the films, of really what's fundamentally a worldview shift. And this is really key, because in our current worldview, which has been primarily based on scarcity, on conflict and controlled division, very kind of mechanistic, everything is, you know, in a way, kind of entropy is bringing everything down, and it's kind of a one-way street. Therefore, you know, we need to take care of our own. We need to have authority and control and domination and all the stuff that has been playing out for centuries is in fact based on a worldview that's not true. And what we understand now is that through a scientific worldview understanding is that it's quite the opposite, that we actually live in a vastly abundant universe, that nature and the cosmos is founded upon a vast energy field, a unified field, and that we actually can now understand how to come into alignment and resonance and harmony with that field. And when we have that perspective, it changes the way we even think about these questions. Because right now we're operating with structures that don't think that way and don't want us to think that way, and that are imposing, you know, controls and in creating conflicts, literally creating conflicts in order to destabilize and to basically put people in fear, and then, you know, problem, reaction, solution, you know, continue down a path that is based on an agenda, based on a worldview that is really not ultimately valid. And so this is a key thing when we have this conversation about what would it look like, how could it work. We need to do it in that context. And then along with that comes the technological shift that is just beyond imagination, really, what is coming with the advancements of AI that we don't even know about yet, that are already rapidly, it's one of the most highly funded areas of technological innovation that's going on, that of course is permeating out into our technological systems and societies and cultures already, and yet what's to come is just vastly beyond that. And then also, you know, the technologies is, well, before we got on here, we were talking about the ones that are for and are represented in the film for creating physical health, you know, physical, mental, and emotional health in our beings, as well as generating energy from clean sources, unlimited, abundant energy. This all radically transforms our ability to come into to create a healthy and thriving world at a very practical, physical, down-to-earth level. That so that full spectrum of the worldview shift, the understanding, and the implementation of our ability to come into resonant interaction with that field foundationally changes the nature of this conversation. And you know, that's the one that it's emphasized in the films, because really without that, we just continue down a trajectory that is, like you said, the EU and the UN are the best we've got. Well, we need to actually shift the worldview that the best is actually working from, in order to then get to the kind of create the kind of a world that we really all feel in our hearts is what we want. Yeah. And so the best that we've got, I would say, needs to get way better, because right now I don't think it's actually going to meet the challenge, and probably worse.
No, I'd agree. I mean, it's our current governance systems are definitely inadequate to dealing with the complexity of the challenge at the moment. And that question of world shift is indeed key. And this is, I think, one of the issues, or one of the challenges I've seen around the movement is it's a worldviews develop over time. So, if you follow the developmental psychology or integral theory, or all these maps that Ken Wilber has pulled together that show essentially that people move from egocentric to ethnocentric to world-centric to cosmocentric in terms of who they identify with and what they think is important and what they're wanting to protect. So from feeling that it's them that's the most important thing, to it's a certain in-group that is identified by the out-groups, as it were, to seeing themselves as a world citizen of the planet, to seeing themselves as kind of plugged into the unified field of the cosmos, as it were. That's a developmental journey. And the percentage of, and there's no judgment, it's really important about that. There's no judgment on where people are in their development. People, from a developmental psychology perspective, develop based on how best they adapt to their life conditions around them. So it's about, does your worldview fit your life conditions? Does it help you to, make sense of the world around you and come up with appropriate solutions to it? But the challenge is then that if, there's a very small percentage of people who would actually hold that cosmocentric worldview and being able to talk about it in the way you're talking about it, and that they talk about it in the Thrive film, and actually not just conceptually talk about it, but really have an experience of it, right? I mean, if we take that's kind of cosmocentric. Now, if you look at the vast majority of the human population at the moment, we're talking ethnocentric, some coming into world-centric. So that's a major challenge, and it feels to me that that's also part of what I perceive as a little bit of naivety sometimes in the movement. And what has helped me really to understand this is, Ken Wilber's distinction between, says you've got the conventional, which is where the world is now, the current governing systems, let's say. And then there's always in society an anti-conventional movement. So people who are anti the way things are now. But that anti has two aspects to it. It has people who have been through, let's say, the world-centric or ethnocentric perspectives and are now cosmocentric, and therefore who are anti the conventional because they can see beyond it. Mm-hmm. And you have a pre-conventional, anti-conventional, as it were, a group who haven't yet accepted, as it were, the kind of governing mechanisms of the conventional. So in this case, let's say your governing elite is kind of more around world-centric. And then you've got a kind of anti from ethnocentric, and you've got an anti from cosmocentric. Mm. And if there's a risk, right, that, let's say, a cosmocentric anti, because it's anti-conventional, attracts the ethnocentric anti-conventional movement, right, that is more, kind of just in it to protect its own, not really interested in the good of the whole, but interested in its own, protecting its own in-group with force if it needs to, and not willing to accept the rules of the state because they sees them as being oppressive for their own local community, compared to a cosmocentric perspective that understands that there are rules needed, but is in this quest for how to kind of enable that process to emerge in a way that serves the good of the whole. And you can see it in in all sorts of different movements. Like in Brexit, there was an anti-Brexit movement. Part of it was nationalist, and was, we want to, you know, Britain for Britain, and we don't want to be part of anything international. We're an empire kind of thing. That's the kind of ethnocentric, pre-conventional perspective. But there was also a post-conventional anti-Brexit, which was that the EU is is a kind of centralized governing system that is very much influenced by industry, that is making decisions that aren't good for the planet, and that we need to find another way of governing internationally, and that the EU is essentially inadequate to that. Now, those two voices, they just get lost in the anti-conventional story. And of course, it's the pre-conventional that is more vocal and more polarizing, and that attracts people because of its emotion and its passion more. Whereas the post-conventional is more subtle in its argument, right? But can't find the space. And part of what I've seen, and I think this links to the whole conspiracy question, part of what I've seen is how you get pre-conventional energies drawn into this movement that's trying to kind of bring a post-conventional perspective to things, but also ends up somehow playing to the pre-conventional that, you know, would, like we saw at the Capitol, would be quite happy to pick up arms and use force to bring down the state. So that's, you know, that's part of what I've struggled with, I think, is sometimes a slight naivety in this movement that doesn't understand a developmental perspective and thinks that anybody can just plug into the unified field at any time and we'll all be okay. You know, how do you see that?
Well, we're all always plugged into the unified field, and we're all always okay because of it.
Consciously.
But it reminds me of Bucky Fuller's wonderful statement, "Dare to be naive." And here was a man who was incredibly informed about the state of the world, more than probably almost anybody else during his time. And I think what he meant by that was to hold this ideal, this world-centric ideal, or cosmic-centric ideal, hold that in mind all the time and represent that as the ideal that is going to inform everything else, you know, the process of moving towards that ideal. And there is a naive aspect to that, because it is basically choosing to hold a perspective that is not congruent with, just like you described, you know, the conventional and the pre and post conventional dynamics and tensions that are, you know, generally often struggling to find the way. And so I think there's a role and a place for that naive representation of the ideal, that we actually need to embrace and welcome it into the dialogue. And then we have the challenges that, just as you've described. And, you know, that's just such a much more complex conversation. In part, it's coming to my mind because so much of it in our present day is fueled by how that is presented to us through the media. And, you know, what I consider to be propaganda wars that are primarily what's playing out right now, information wars, propaganda wars, that are, I would say, kind of at best confusing everybody at this point. You know, I'm astounded. I personally stopped watching television about 40 years ago because I just thought, this is kind of nuts. It's kind of insane. I'm not really getting something that's useful for me here. That doesn't mean I'm ignorant of what's going on in the world. There's, you know, especially with the internet now, I know what's going on. I get to choose how and where and what I'm going to take in, and I expose myself. I mean, if you engage in looking at a Facebook feed, you basically are just going to get inundated with all sorts of perspectives. And in a way, that's a way of doing a little pulse check on what's being presented. But the point is that the challenges you're talking about, first of all, they're very real. There is that spectrum of consciousness that I know is foundational to your personal research and investigations about our evolution here. And these are all considerations that will inform the conversation. And ultimately, I do feel, though, that the larger, bigger picture worldview shift, first of all, it's accelerating so rapidly now because of the media technology communication systems that we have. And that there is also a way to bring it down to a very personal small in the sense of scale and engagement in ourselves and in the world level. For example, just let's say a healing modality that is based on resonance with the field, that does not need to be described as that for somebody to find benefit from it, that may eliminate the need, will likely eliminate the need to take pharmaceutical prescriptions that are causing detrimental side effects to them, or direct effects, as Bruce Lipton said in the film Thrive 2. That this could eliminate that challenge in their lives through a beautiful, pure, very viable, because these things already exist, solution to that problem they have, that's based on understanding the nature of the field and in a whole nother worldview perspective that they don't even need to know about. And so there's a way to bring it into an actualization in people's lives without necessarily having to convince them, oh, you're going to shift your worldview now. Now that will come along with it, I think, ultimately. And another example is our friend and colleague Nassim Haramein, who I work with. We have what's called the Resonance Academy, studying unified physics and the nature of the field. And we have an online program that we made free last year at the beginning of this recent journey we've all been on. And we have now close to 100,000 people that are engaging in that inquiry. And so I think there's a deep, deep thirst and hunger for a worldview that is going to provide a lens and a perspective where we can start to see, oh, this is actually how we can do it. Because right now, I don't think we have that in our world. I think we're just being presented with how we can't do it, essentially.
It reminds me of that, a classic kind of marketing adoption curve, where you talk about, you got the innovators, and then you got the early adopters, and then you got late adopters, and then you got the laggards. Yeah. Essentially, we just need to kind of keep going, and maybe we've got some of the innovators, maybe we're as far as that now, and put out the invitation to those who are resonant. But at the same time, I would add, and be very conscious of what we're saying that it is and what we're saying that it isn't. So we don't also kind of attract energy that is anti-conventional, but in a very destructive way, let's say. And that's part of the art, I think. But I'm going to put you on the spot, Marshall. So do you believe that there is a conspiracy of an elite group of people trying to kind of preserve their power and resources, who are preventing all of this stuff? And has it infiltrated our political and democratic systems, media systems? I know this is part of the kind of perspective in Thrive. What's your personal view on that?
Yeah. When I assess the dynamics of the world from the perspectives of the strata of economic well-being, shall we say, where we have a fractional percent that has the vast majority of wealth in their control. Obviously, that is just such a gross imbalance that in and of itself, it creates a dynamic that is causing I would say, a lot of the challenges that we face in our world. It does not have to be that way. It's optional. It's not a given. And what comes with that level of vast wealth abundance is an ability to have control and to influence the direction of any aspect of the world, basically. And that's been going on for a long time. You know, the idea of a ruling class, or originally, as also presented in Thrive 2, originating from a predator class, those who see the ability to take control, take power, and can have control over others, then they don't want to lose that. Once you have it, you don't want to lose it, because if you lose it, now you're going to be controlled by somebody else, and you don't want that. So that dynamic in the fear-based human psyche has evolved over time to the point we're at now, where there's this just, vast magnitude of control of wealth in the hands of a very small few that do own all of the media. 6 companies own all of the media outlets that do have the greatest lobbying power in political systems, and use that influence to basically control that strata of the whole systemic dynamics that we're involved with here. So I do very much feel that it's not actually a conspiracy, because it's pretty much coming out in the open now. I believe with the proposal of the Great Reset and the fourth industrial revolution that's coming out of the WEF and the partnerships aligned with that, the stakeholders, as they call them, is actually putting forth a more overt agenda of what has been, let's say, more of a conspiracy. I was like, this word conspiracy, I think it's so confused right now what that actually means for people, because it is being portrayed as something that's not real, when in fact it's defined as a secret plan to do something unlawful or harmful. And so it's just a plan that's not public yet. Let's put it that way, in a very simple term. That's what a conspiracy is. It's not something that's false. It's been portrayed as being something that's false. I think people generally lump that idea into, with that word, that, oh, it's not real. It's actually just something that's secret. And I do feel that there has been an ongoing, for hundreds of years, but escalating in our current conventional world, to have greater and greater control and greater and greater capacity to create systems that enhance that control. And our technologies now make that vastly possible. The magnitude of censorship that's happening now is unprecedented, in the fact that there are a few that control the major media, social networking, and mainstream media outlets that suppress very, very vital conversations about treatments for COVID, for example, that are not allowed to be talked about as freely as other things are. So why is that? So to me, I do feel that there is an agenda that is being played out exactly as described. And
in
that
the
there's
chat, Marshall, in the chat, there's a couple of people asking if you could say a bit more about the Great Reset, and also Beth says, do you think there is a secret plan? And how does this relate to like the Great Reset? And by the way, is this also the same thing as the deep state that people talk about, or is that something different?
Well, I'm sharing my opinions rather than definitive answers. Let's put it that way, to be clear. But I would say the deep state, just to start there, would be that strata that I mentioned, that state governmental systemic aspect of what is a strata, a spectrum, shall I say, of power and influence and control. And the deep state would be what we don't know, what we can't see, what's not shown to us, that is connected into the vast, abundant wealth control, small percentage that have the influence through the money, primarily, that powerful influence that then comes in through that part of that strata and into then what we do see and what we're told. Now, what we do see and what we're told is not what is actually happening behind the scenes. So in that regard, to answer the other question, there is a secret agenda. I think it just by pure logic, it would make sense that there would be one. To think that there isn't, I think, is actually very naive. And so it would just make sense that when there's that kind of a dynamic of that much power and control, that there would be things that we don't know about that are being talked about, that are being planned and being pursued, that are not based on us knowing about them and giving our permission. Because that's too complex. It's a lot simpler just to do it yourselves when you have that ability. So I would say, yes, that's very much the case and has been going on. And we need to honestly admit that that's true. And because if you don't admit it's true and you naively think, well, people aren't like that, they're not going to do that, then we're not really acknowledging the human psyche and the dynamics that we were referring to. Even the post and pre-conventional play out at that level. And
so how do you, when you accept that as true, which you seem to have done, how do you relate to that reality? How do you then, it's like, it seems to me, and I've been on that quest and, read various of the books and done some research myself. And the place I ended up was, look, this may be true. I've read a lot of stuff. If it's true, then there's something going on. I don't know, to be honest. I can't prove it in any way. It could be true. If I was to accept it was true, what would be the implications of that? And at one level, it could feel immensely disempowering because, this is completely beyond my sphere of control or even influence. And the place I ended up with was, well, actually, and it comes back to Buckminster Fuller, which is build an alternative that makes the old one obsolete, and an alternative that they cannot get their hands on, essentially, that operates kind of almost in parallel to the current system, which is why I put, quite a lot of my attention on building parallel local economic systems, looking at how do you enable people to be able to regain some sense of control from this expertocracy that everything is being outsourced to, from trust the expert on your health, trust the expert on economics, whatever, but where you actually regain some kind of ownership of those aspects of your life rather than just outsourcing the decisions to the inverted commas experts. And that way, start to build the parallel systems that are going to be needed anyway. At some point in time, but there's no point, it didn't feel to me any point in putting any energy in trying to fight that, big powerful system or whatever, because one, don't have the resources, and two, how are you going to get to them anyway? But to focus on, and it's a question of where you put your attention again, right? Where you put your attention is what grows. So putting our attention on building that alternative and proceeding until apprehended, basically, and then dealing with the issue if we are apprehended is all we can do. Or at least this is the way I have coped with the possibility of what you're saying being true. I'd be intrigued how you when it kind of landed with you that, holy cow, this might actually be true. What did it do with the way you decided to cope with that reality and lead your life, essentially?
Mm-hmm. It's a great great question. To embrace this idea as being true when we haven't done that before, to actually take it in it can be just so overwhelming and threatening and scary, and can really bring up so much questions about our own sense of power and authority in ourselves that you've described. And I found in my process, and I know this is true for just so many people, that when we actually do that, we're actually reclaiming our power, because we're getting honest, rather than being naive and innocently trusting in something out of our reach. We're actually seeing it for what it is for the first time. And when we see it for what it is, then we can get into the process that you described of, well, if that's, let's put it in the context of a not as desirable direction that we want to head, just in a general way of describing it, that we can now engage in. First of all, in order to solve a problem, you need to know what the problem is. And so the reason I know that Foster and Kimberly have emphasized this in the films is that they always say, we need to know what the problem is. We need to know what we're dealing with so that we can then address that problem consciously and compassionately, really, and not be ignorant and naive about it. Because if we are, then we're basically kind of playing into being subject to it, and so it's a process of awakening ourselves to could that really be a reality? And let's look around at the what's the circumstances and the possible symptoms of that being true. And when you look at the vast magnitude of corruption and control, I would say in our government, our state systems, I would say in our medical system, education, for example, trying to get the unified physics out into mainstream academia is extremely hard because it's a very controlled system based on mostly budgets, money again. So anyway, it's a process of reconciling that in ourselves. I do think it's very empowering. So it's not that it inevitably ends up in our feeling small and weak. It actually, the ability to come together to then do what you described that Bucky Fuller said, which is to create. He said, when I solve a problem, I don't look at the old problem and try to fix that. I create a solution that obsoletes that problem. And I think that's just brilliant and exactly what needs to happen. And I'm actually very encouraged because I've been having conversations with some people recently. I personally believe that in order to mitigate a increasing domination and control agenda that is rampant with surveillance and potentially with control of the entire, I don't want to call it money system, economic system, because the nature of money itself is going to change. That could just permeate our societies, our cultures, our experiences, just down to our individual level very rapidly. The way that is going to be countermeasured and mitigated from being too much domination and control is a systemic shift. That to change minds is going to be what takes longer, like you said. It's a much more challenging process to change minds, but that a systemic shift where we can create a system that empowers the decentralization, the empowerment down to the smaller scales, rather than the empowerment up to the large scale, which is what is being pursued now. That is what's going to really make a difference and obsolete the ability for that other agenda to play out. I think it's actually critical we do that if we want to have the option to go in that other direction. Because right now, the other question was about the Great Reset. And, that's a proposal from the World Economic Forum, headed by Klaus Schwab, who has written a book about it, and a book called, a recent one called The Fourth Industrial Revolution. And it's the advancements of the agenda to create a one world governing body and a one world digital money control system, economic system that, even proposes, for example, in the writings, he says, by 2030, you won't own anything and you'll be happy about it. Basically it's a shift from, I think it includes the what's the word, the relief of debt, the absolving of debt, which of course, it's like a jubilee, but it's not, I don't think it's put in those terms, but where your debt is forgiven, and yet there's going to be some kind of a consequence of that, of where you're giving, you're basically giving your property over to ownership to somebody else, and you won't own the cars or the this or the that, so the other things. It's all going to be rented, basically. The question then comes to, well, who owns it all and who am I renting it from? And this is where that agenda is to create a globalized system of that level of control. That is what's being presented in the Great Reset, and coming from the WEF and the UN and these global partnerships, the IMF.
Because in principle, that idea of
the combination.
that idea of renting a car, right,
yeah,
is not bad. I mean, we have here a scheme called My Wheels. I don't own a car, but I have access to 10 cars in the neighborhood, half of which are being charged at a solar panel covered car park over there, and are electric cars. And I don't really want to own a car. I want to, because I don't need to be, because most of the time I'm not using it. So it's a waste of resources for everybody to own a car. So to be sharing them is much more effective. The question is, I think what you're saying is, it comes down to, well, who owns the cars that you're renting from, and what control do they have over your right to use it?
Exactly. That is the question. That is the whole point. In and of itself, ownership of a car is not really the question. It's that control and the rights, and in a voluntary based, healthy capitalistic system where there's a company that owns the cars, that provides you the ability to rent them when you need to, and does not impose limitations on your ability to do so that are unreasonable, or that are violating your right to do so in some way, or your right to live your life. That's great. That's exactly the point of what we want to be able to do. And we don't want it to have excessive top-down control. And the concern is, and the important thing for us to be aware of is that excessive top-down control being put in place as this proposed new future of the fourth industrial revolution, which is heavily AI based, which I think is inevitable personally. But again, it comes down to the ethics and principles upon which it's being pursued. And that's why it's so key right now to keep in mind, is that top-down excessive control part of that agenda that's being pursued? And if so, how can we shift that so it's not going to be, grossly out of balance and causing detriment, where we actually really can and ought to be able to be creating benefit and harmony through more of a decentralized.
Content-wise, we might look at, because I've read those proposals, and we might look at them, if that's a good step forward, from it just being about money, it's now about, ecological stewardship and other things. They're wanting to plant a billion trees or whatever. The question is the governance structures that are put in place behind that.
That's
content.
the whole point there.
Yeah,
exactly. And something like the climate accords and the whole idea of a global carbon tax, as it's not a solution, first of all, to our problem. It's a measure that basically siphons a whole bunch of money and puts it into where's that money go, and to who to do what. That's where the fundamental question around what's being proposed as the most appropriate approach to the climate challenges we have is not necessarily the best path to pursue.
Although on the one hand, to tax pollution and to take tax off people's creativity, so to not tax work and productivity, to shift the tax from that to pollution, would seem like a sensible thing to do. Just as you said, it's about the control of those resources ultimately.
It seems like a sensible thing, except for it's still imposing what you might call a violation on, you're basically imposing one violation on top of another. Pollution is a violation. They're polluters in industry that are causing detriment in the world. All right, let's now impose then another violation on them. We'll take their money. That's the better thing to do. Well, first of all, it's not a solution. They're still polluting. So now you have two violations basically that are not solving a problem. And
that could take us down a huge. We're going to have to stop us because we're running out of time. That could take us down a huge rabbit hole of the question of tax, and is tax a justifiable means to pay for the collective needs, et cetera, et cetera. So we could certainly continue down there. I mean, just to finish it, to say, when I let that possibility into my reality that it might be true, I did in the end find it had a very grounding effect in terms of me really focusing, okay, well, regardless of whether that's true or not, what am I going to focus on doing to build the alternative? And I think part of the issue is that you see quite a few people, particularly on social media, devoting their energy to trying to, with all this fear-based post about the conspiracy and, telling everybody else that they're naive and, saying, oh yeah, but there's this big conspiracy and you're not going to be able to do any good anyway. And that kind of makes it hard so then you throw the whole possibility out, right? Because you kind of identifying it with the cranky crowd, as it were, who are, and that's the challenge, is to be able to discern it accurately. But I really appreciated your honesty and your clarity
Thank you.
in the dialogue, and I know a lot of people have from what I can see in the chat. So I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much. I have too, and I would just say, kind of just to complete our thinking around this, that in the face of all we've talked about, the wonderful news is that I believe, have the know-how. We have a vast abundance of new technologies that most people don't even know about yet. And we have the ability to make a systemic shift that is really an option and a choice that we can pursue, which is again the reason Thrive 1 and Thrive 2 were put out. Hey people, this is actually what we could do here. We actually have the know-how, the technologies, and the ability to make a shift in this direction. And we need to highlight this is the direction that it's going at this time. And so the good news is that we really, I think, can feel extremely empowered knowing that by understanding this worldview and embracing what's possible, we can actually course correct our spaceship Earth here very effectively, and I think very efficiently and quickly, while also not being too naive about what else is going on here.
Yeah,
So thank you so much for having me and having this conversation today. I really enjoyed it and appreciate all you guys are doing.
Great. Thanks, Marshall. And Jim, back to you.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Marshall. Very stimulating. I just feel like I want to make one comment on conspiracies as we close. All of us are in conspiracies. And that's what makes the world so complex. And I'd like to just pause for a moment and explain. The original connotation of the word conspiracy is those who breathe together, to co-inspire, to breathe together. Humanity Rising is a conspiracy. The Democrats, as opposed to the Republicans, are conspiracy in the United States. The Green Party, the Brexit Party, the Big Pharma, Bill Gates, World Economic Forum, the Chinese government, Facebook, all of us, think about it for a moment. All of us are out there in the world trying to get our products or our ideas or our courses or our whatever into the mainstream. All of us are conspiring with our colleagues to implement our program. You mentioned the World Economic Forum. I know a number of the people very high up in the World Economic Forum who believe that what they're doing from where they sit and how they view the world is the most important thing to be done to ensure all the goals that you've been talking about. And so I want to caution us about conspiracy thinking, because I think it demonizes in a way that is debilitating. We're seeing this in the United States right now with Trump and QAnon, talking about the Democrats as pedophiles and satanic, baby eaters. And there's this big conspiracy around the deep state that's conspiring against the Trump administration. And people are talking about that. I mean, when you get into it, and the second point I would make about conspiracies, everyone, is to refer to you to Edward Gibbon and his masterwork, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. He says the seminal law that governs history, and the reason why, even if you're a Caesar and you have absolute power, you cannot determine fate, is because of the law of unintended consequences. And that's worth just considering when we consider anybody that's telling us there's a conspiracy out there, is that the levels of people with intention moving into the public domain. And then let's talk about the effect of the planets in our solar system. The moon, the sun flares, all the things that are coming out into our public domain, external to human motivation and intention. Intermixing with the ecology of the world, the electromagnetic pulse of the planet that's mixing with human intention, as we've seen through the global coherence pulse, so that when you get down to one little group trying to effectuate their will, as Gibbon noted, it's impossible. And that's why if you look at the studies of anybody who's tried to predict the future, there's not a single person in the history of the world that's been able to do that. because of the complexity of the ecosystem within which we live and breathe and live out our lives. So I want us to just, I wanted to just expand our consciousness here, because I think, Marshall, if I was advising Foster and Kimberly, I would take out this notion of enemy. And I would take out this notion that there's a cabal somewhere, because historically, ontologically, all of us are co-conspiring together for what we want in the world. Some win, some lose, some use certain tactics, some use other tactics, but the outcome is always different in every single case known, at least to the historical record, of what any of the conspirators themselves were seeking to achieve. That's how complex this world is. And as we go into this final decade where scientists are telling us we're running out of time, it feels to me that the conspiratorial nature of our work together on the progressive side needs to accelerate and deepen, not by identifying an enemy, but by trying to discern how we can bring more and more and more people and organizations together in a common conspiracy, breathing together, which what we call radical collaboration for the redemptive benefit of humankind. So anyway, I wanted to just take a moment to broaden our thinking about what it means to breathe together
I love that.
during this time, and because I could feel you wrestling with some of these issues, Marshall. So I just wanted to lighten your load a bit and bring us all into.
I completely agree with you. Just to say really quickly, I completely agree with you. That's where I actually come from, and that's the place I live inside of myself, and that's why I love to be with you all and conspire in this way. And I would just say one little caveat to your recommendation, which is when inventors and doctors are being killed and suppressed, and their inventions not allowed to see the light of day, and medical interventions are, not allowed to be brought into our world, it indicates that there is a problem there. Let's put it that way, in a very gentle way, that I think is important to call out. Yeah. So again, it's the balance between the calling it out and the being in that breathing together conspiracy that is the generative one that we're all here for.
Well, we should do a whole session on the extent and nature of conspiracy on planet Earth right now. That would be a very fascinating dialogue. Sure. But by the way, everyone, Marshall Leffert has a book called Cosmometry, and he goes into the geometry of life in a way that is unsurpassed. And I think, Marshall, we'd love to have you back on Humanity Rising, just to grace us with the elegance and artistry of your cosmic geometry, because that's at the heart of the physics of our world today. So anyway, thank you, Marshall. Thank you, Peter. And then on Monday, we're going to be hearing from Michael Lerner, the executive director of the Spiritual Progressive Network, on the nature of revolutionary love in our time, which is probably the ultimate conspiracy, the conspiracy in which we all need to join to love each other more completely and more honestly and more radically. So that's Monday on Humanity Rising, Michael Lerner, who's one of the great progressive rabbis in the United States on revolutionary love. So thank you, everyone. We'll see you same time, same station, and hope to see you again on Monday. Be well. Thanks, Marshall. Thanks, Peter.
Thank you too. I appreciate it.
Thanks. You're welcome.
Thank you, Peter.